Hello, Councilor Carpenter. Hello, Christy. I see you there. And Christine Curtis as well.
Hi, good evening. How are you?
Doing pretty well. We've had some amazing break from typical November weather, haven't we?
Yeah, it's been beautiful.
Yeah. My watch says 7. My computer says 7:01. We're going to give a couple minutes for Councilor Hightower to join us. Be right back. Oh, there we are.
Hello.
Hello. Looks like we're all here. Hi, Zaria.
Hello, hello.
Okay, we'll call this meeting to order of the City Council Community Development and Neighborhood Revitalization Committee on Tuesday, November 10th, 2020. It is 7:02 p.m. And the first item on our agenda is to approve the agenda.
Motion to approve.
Moved by Councilor Carpenter. Is that a second, Councilor Hightower?
Yes.
Okay, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? The ayes have it. We will move right into the public forum portion of our meeting. And Christine, you can let us know who to be promoted to panelist.
Yes, I had quite a few people sign up ahead of time. If anyone would like to speak and you didn't email me, you can use the raise hand or chat function. First up, we have Christy.
Hello, y'all.
Hello, Christy.
How are you?
Doing pretty well, and you?
Questionable. You'll find out in an email later. Not a good thing. I'm calling in tonight to let Sarah know that your exemptions are unacceptable. We do not need them. It is sanctioned loopholes for the landlords. I realize a lot of them have called in to complain, but any landlord's going to complain about losing one of their rights. The only thing that we will concede on is landlord occupied or owner occupied buildings, as we got to give something, in all cooperation. And that's the only thing we're willing to concede on. And the other two are just, it's not, you would end up wiping out this entire proposal for putting in every single one of these exemptions. And these landlords around here don't deserve it at all, especially the for-profit ones. The little landlords, we have no problem with. It's the for-profit landlords that will use every loophole they can possibly get their hands on against tenants in Burlington. So we very strongly urge you to pass this proposal with the only exemption being owner-occupied buildings. To put them all in there is just, it's not acceptable, and they'll use whatever they can to cause tenants problems, and that's what we're trying to avoid. We don't want them to be able to use no cause at all. You put all those exemptions in, and then that's exactly what they're going to be able to do. We don't want that. We want change for the better. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. And Christine, who's up next as a panelist?
Next, we have Stephen Marshall.
Okay, good evening, Stephen. I see you have connected, so whenever you're ready. Looks like you're still muted, Stephen, but you're on our screen. At least your name is.
There's a button that says unmute.
There you go. You
All
did
right,
it.
good. I don't know why I can't see myself on the screen. My laptop works fine, but I've got several points to make. I looked at the proposed document today as marked up by Sarah Carpenter, and I have to say that about a third of this doesn't belong in here. I would like to first make the observation that this is not an ordinance. This is charter change. This is a document which is expected to empower the city council. So you could actually suffice with the first sentence, which I've modified for clarity, to read, to provide by ordinance the conditions under which evictions and non-renewal of leases may occur, and to prohibit such without just cause. I propose to you that that is all you need, because from there, the city council takes over in its political process to decide what the terms of that ordinance shall be. For the political convenience of getting this thing passed, I think it's acceptable to specify a little bit of what just cause includes and excludes. I would like to make the observation that non-renewal of lease is not equal to eviction. That eviction is a legal proceeding and non-renewal of lease is just something that people do. So that is why I included the phrase non-renewal of rental leases in the version of the first sentence that I've read to you. And also further down, you have a case where it says the ordinance may also set a maximum rent increase, blah, 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 blah. I added, after de facto evictions, I added, or forced non-renewal. Forced non-renewal would be where the rent increase made it impossible for the person to renew their lease. So that augments that phrasing. The next sentence after that, if you look at it now, I'd like to point out, and you guys probably can't pull it up so fast, but I did send this to you by email, and do you see it in front of you, Sarah?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. How about you, Soraya? Do you see it?
I'm just checking my email.
Okay. All righty. So below the A, B, C, A, B, a little bit further down, you have the rent increase provision, blah, 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 blah. This is completely unnecessary rhetorical posturing. I added a sentence here to clarify the intent that I think Sarah was driving at in her markup. Such ordinance shall not be construed to apply to temporary or transient facilities operated without leases, except as enforced by state law. That takes care of all of the other gobbledygook about hospitals, school dormitories, properties rented, blah, 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 blah. This is not an ordinance. This is a charter change, and you've got to keep it simple. Okay, further down, you have further exempted from the requirements of this provision. Oh, this is another case where I simplified some language, and as per convention, I underlined all my additions. Further, exempted from the requirements of this provision shall be owners who occupy their property with 3 or fewer rental units. This places a limit. It says if you own a huge property, you're not a mom and pop property owned occupier anymore. Up to 3 units, you can be excluded from the requirements of this charter change, of what this charter change enables. Let's keep it clear. All this other stuff here about exemptions from provisions related to properties in the rental market, family member intending to move in, that I covered. Properties in need of substantial repair or renovation, rental sublets, blah, blah, blah. These are all things that the city council is due and expected to deal with. This does not belong in a charter change, period. And the last thing that the idea of conditions under which evictions and non-renewal of leases may occur does not cover is the communication that the landlord may be required to provide to tenants. So the last line, which I believe I don't know whether it was there before or it's been added, but I left it intact. The ordinance may require landlords to provide notice, blah, blah, blah. The rest of that sentence together. I want to emphasize again, this is supposed to be empowering charter change and not the ordinance. You need to simplify it and pare it down to its bare, least necessary clauses. And simplify it, get rid of all the unnecessary language. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and for providing us with the written comments is much appreciated as well. Christine, do you have someone lined up next?
Next up is Dan.
Okay. Dan, you're ready to roll?
Yep. So I would like to speak against the exemptions to the just cause evictions amendment or charter change or whatever it's called. And particularly, I wanted to draw attention to the first exemption being for, I suppose, tenants who have not yet been there for a year. I can't help but think that whoever added that exemption is either unaware of or deliberately concealing the reality of what most renters deal with in downtown Burlington, particularly student renters. And what I mean by this is a lot of students and people, shortly out of college are in a situation where they're going to be somewhat transient in their time in town. And as a result of this, if you're a student, or even like I'm not a student anymore, but I still have to sign a new lease more than 6 months usually in advance of my move-in date, essentially because landlords in Burlington collude with each other with their understanding that students often move from place to place year to year, and through coordination create a market where which is unlike any other market in the United States, to my knowledge, where people need to sign their leases well in advance of when they're moving into their apartments. And
Dan, we got you right at the end of people need to sign leases well in
it
advance.
limits my ability to plan for my future when I have to decide if I want to live here for the next year, a year and 6 months before I would even move into the apartment I'd be signing a lease for. So I think that the rationale behind even having governance or having a city council is, among other things, to prevent the infringement of people's personal liberties by private individuals and to regulate where necessary to prevent that. And I think that this exemption would prevent the city council from being able to regulate to prevent this collusion to force people to sign leases well in advance of when they're moving in, because it would mean that nearly all landlords that are renting to students or in the downtown area where students live would be exempt from these provisions, and they would be able to continue forcing people to either renew their lease or sign a new one in October or November when they're moving in next June. I think that's totally unacceptable. And I really don't see any rationale for keeping this exemption. I mean, this isn't a you can't evict someone for any reason amendment, or I'm not really sure what it is, amendment, ordinance, stuff like that, but it's not you can't evict someone for any reason, it's just cause. And I can't really, I suppose the rationale is you get someone in there for less than a year, you don't know if they're going to be a good tenant or not, but it seems like under this legislation you could still evict bad tenants. You just couldn't evict someone for no reason. And I don't see any reason why it should take a year for that to apply. And I think that the fact that that is an exemption creates a huge loophole that would greatly limit the ability of those provisions to protect tenants, specifically student tenants, and also people like myself who have recently graduated. Like, I'm worried that if this ordinance passed as it stands with this exemption, it would be really hard for me to find an apartment because a landlord wouldn't take me over a student who's probably going to move out of town in a couple of years, because they just think, oh, I'm going to need a just cause to evict Dan, but you know, the student's leaving anyway, so I don't have to worry about that. So I think that with that exemption in particular, you're really playing with fire.
Okay, thank you, Dan. And Christine, who is next?
Tom Proctor.
Tom Proctor, okay. Tom's done this a couple of times, so he knows what to do next.
Hey, folks. Yeah, so some of these exemptions, I think, has already been discussed by Christy Delphia. Sorry, thank you all for being on the call this evening. I want to start out by saying that. Some of these exemptions, and specifically the one that Christy talked about in terms of owner-occupied buildings, that's something that we feel that is fair as an exemption. I feel that the relationship between a landlord and a tenant, when the landlord is living in the same building, is a different kind of relationship to a for-profit landlord or an investment landlord who is living off-site. And I believe that that exemption should stand in this this charter change language. However, I would like to echo the worries of the last caller, Dan, and say that I really do believe that having having just cause not kick in until after a year, I could see that being incredibly problematic. And I think it would actually exacerbate the problem of no cause evictions through leases ending. And I do worry that, like many of these other clauses in these exemptions, like many of these other exemptions in this charter change language, if it does end up passing, if there ends up being loopholes that can be exploited, they will be, and to fix that will be a politically fraught process that will take a very long time. It could really damage tenants in the meantime. So I would like to again also echo the second caller and say that let's try and keep this language relatively simple. This work can be done at the ordinance level later on, but would like to repeat that I think it's fair to exempt owner-occupied buildings, but wouldn't support any of the other exemptions that are outlined by Sarah. But I also, but thank you for all the work you three are doing. I do feel like this is showing that you're taking this very seriously and are doing the correct amount of research before going forward with this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Tom. And Christine, who's in the queue here?
Jessica Hyman.
Okay, Jessica, welcome to the public forum.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Well, thank you so much, Councillors Pine, Carpenter, and Hightower. So I'm Jess Hyman from the Fair Housing Project at CVOEO, and I submitted comments to the committee earlier in the discussion process about just cause. But I just wanted to add a few additional thoughts that echoing some of the things you've just heard. So, you know, as you know, the just cause eviction policies that are in place now all over the country really strengthen those tenants' rights and add additional protections. And these protections impact the most vulnerable members of our communities, you know, especially those most affected by housing instability and discrimination. And so that's the lens that I'm looking at this with. And so I'd really urge you to support a very basic just cause charter change language without getting too far into the weeds and adding too much to this charter change language, because there will, as other folks have just said, you know, there'll be plenty of time to craft the full ordinance and discuss the details, including exemptions, later in the ordinance process. And I think the more general the language is now, the more freedom that you'll have to craft something that really works best and meets the needs of all Burlington residents, you know, tenants and owners later on. So that's that's what I wanted to say. And thank you so much for your thoughtful approach to all this and the time and consideration that you've all put into this, this charter change. You've done a lot of research and listened to a lot of people saying a lot of the same things over and over again. And I really appreciate your time. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Jess. And Christine, who is in the queue?
So next, I just see a phone number. I don't have a name, but I will move them over now.
Okay.
Oh, I don't know if they'll move to panelists, but we should be able to hear them at least.
Okay.
Oh, there they are.
Hi, this is Sharon Busher. Can you hear me?
Oh, hi, Sharon. Yes, we can.
Okay, so I haven't attended one of your meetings, so I have a question. I'm actually attending 2 meetings simultaneously, so forgive me. I didn't know, Councillor Pine, I actually wanted to take part in your item on licensing landlords, and I wasn't sure if when you got to that, you would allow me to speak at that time, or whether I needed to make my comments now during public forum.
In the past, we've always taken up comments related to a specific issue when that item comes up on the agenda. So I would say that you're welcome to stay with us and join us when we get to that item number 4.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. And Christine, is that the extent of our comment?
We have one more, Erhard Menka.
Okay. Welcome, Erhard. You've been enabled.
Thank you, Counselor. Sorry, I had a barking dog in the background, and he's a little distracting and large. So actually, I had the same question that Sharon did. My comments were going to be twofold. One on just cause, but then also on landlord licensing. So given what you said to Sharon, I'm going to defer on landlord licensing and stay on the call. Like others on Just Cause, I really support the original language for all the reasons that everyone else has stated. Now, I do understand the political realities. You've had a lot of comments in opposition to the charter change, and I understand Councilor Carpenter's motivation for including exemptions in the language as a really maybe facing a political reality of trying to allay some of the concerns and some of the fears that are out there now. But I do think that, as others have said, it unduly restricts your ability to to craft a good ordinance if and when the voters and ultimately the legislature support the charter change. So I would encourage you, if you all decide that you need to include maybe the owner-occupied exemption, as a way of signaling that you're going to consider that and possibly consider other exemptions. I could go along with that. I would urge you to look at an alternative approach, which would not be a guarantee to folks who have raised concerns around some of these issues, but possibly through a resolution by the City Council stating basically that if this passes, you would be, the City Council would be on record as saying it would strongly consider all or some of these exemptions as part of the ordinance crafting process. Realize that's not a guarantee, and it may not provide the same level of comfort that some folks who've expressed concerns might receive through actually incorporating the language in the charter change. But I just think putting too much language in the charter change it's really, it runs counter to, as Stephen said, it runs counter to charter change, and it just unduly ties your hands down the road. That said, I mean, I do think that these are exemptions that should be considered. They're in, they're basically a compilation of the exemptions in many of the other ordinances around the country, and it's certainly reasonable to consider those. And if there's another way of kind of providing some assurances that they will be genuinely considered by the city council, I think I would search for that kind of approach. I would say I'm particularly concerned about the exemption for rehabilitation. We've seen, I've been in this business for over 30 years now, and we've seen wave after wave of landlords that come in, buy a property, and then do some perfunctory renovations, change the finishes, put in new floor finishes, new countertops, and then call that substantial rehabilitation. That should not be a reason to be exempt from just cause. So that one's of particular concern to me, and I'm concerned about you tying your hands. So if there's another method like a resolution that would provide some level of assurance to the critics and those with concerns, I would urge you to take that approach, but keep this to the absolute minimum that you need to in terms of language and potential exemptions that you want to include. Thank you. And thanks for your time and all your thoughtfulness. I know everybody's really working hard on this. Thanks.
Thanks for sharing your comments with the committee. We'll make sure to come back to you during the discussion about licensing of rental property owners. And Christine, Curtis, is there anything else, anyone else ready to speak in public forum?
No, that's all I have on my list.
Okay. So what I had hoped we could do is, I think the question was asked, it was a great question. I think Councilor Hightower asked it at least in one forum, is, hasn't this ordinance already gone, from our committee, or this resolution, this charter change, gone from our committee to charter change and now is due to come back to the full council? And therefore, what are we doing as a committee on this? And it's a good point that illustrates that the city council process is one that is not quite as straight and linear as maybe other legislative processes, which have an ensured path to follow, because we as a committee, as any committee, can take up an issue and debate or discuss changes that we think might be warranted. And so looks like another speaker, another panelist is looking to speak. Christine, do you see that? Tara is looking to speak.
I did not get her request. I'm seeing it now in the chat though, so
Okay.
I can go over if you would like.
If you could put her to panelists, that'd be great before we get into item 3. Yeah. Okay, Tara, you're on our screen, so when you're ready, just hit your mute button and we'll be all set.
Evening, everyone. Thank you very much. The purpose of me contacting you tonight to sit in this meeting is deeply personal. I am one of the vulnerable members of this community who would suffer greatly if just for whatever reason, because, and this is happening in my personal life now, political feelings that I have about my reproductive rights and my gender is at odds with someone who's managing the property that I live in. If my housing is threatened and I'm made homeless as a result of that, I have contacted agencies now that it is so difficult to even get a voice or be heard. And it is a complicated and long process, and it's exhausting, and sometimes it's daily. And you put emails, and you send emails, you do phone calls, and this is before anything has even happened really severe yet. To be not housed, or the threat of being evicted and having to go through this process, is even more nightmarish for me. The language, if that's the topic, I hope is plain and simple and easy for everyone to understand. We are all confused. I've sat in on a few of these meetings and I hear there's so much confusion, and the topic itself is so hard to dissect because everyone seems to take away something different. I certainly hope that it's not pared down like most good intentions are that are set to go to legislation until the original intent is what it was in the beginning. So that's all that I have. But again, there are a lot of people like me in this community. I'm seeing more and more and more facing, living out in the streets as opposed to a dignified life, simply because we have to be afraid of people who have more power than us. And I know these situations, if you're paying your rent on time and you're abiding by your lease and you're not doing anything crazy or unrealistic, what is the harm in that? And if it prevents a cycle of homelessness within the community, or people struggling yes, that's all I have. Thank you all for your hard work. I look forward to hearing some success with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara, for sharing that with our committee. Christine, just one more last check. Are we completed with our public forum, those who wish to speak in public forum?
Yes, let me check my email real quick. I have no more requests at this time.
Okay. As noted in the minutes, comments can also be made during the meeting on agenda items by using the raise hand function, or you can also put it into the chat if you need to. We will, as a committee, recognize those and allow those. We would ask you to keep it brief because once we, as a committee, begin doing our work, we just need time to try and get our work done as a committee. We are scheduled to meet till 8:30. Many of us were at City Council. Well, we were all at City Council till midnight last night, and I may not be the only one, but I know that I am only able to take these meetings for so many hours and still stay productive. So, having said that, the discussion of the potential exemptions for just cause eviction charter change, I think it seems as though a consensus has emerged, and that's always a good thing to highlight and to call it out and to hopefully just confirm around the notion of someone pointed out that the audio is cutting out. Is that true for everyone? Are you not hearing my audio?
I hear you well.
Okay. Hopefully that's just unique to one person's connection. Everyone else says it's fine. Okay. So the issue of owner-occupied properties. And I think a suggestion was made by one of the speakers in the public forum that we in fact specify owner-occupied properties of 3 units or less. So that was a very specific suggestion for us to consider. Why don't we try to find consensus here on whether that language should in fact be included, and just ask if you could share with them, the rest of us now, the committee members that is, what your thoughts are on that.
So I'm okay with that language. I would prefer that it says it closer up top. So where it says like may exclude expiration of rental agreements. And then I'm not sure what we're doing with that B part, since that also is just a change, but then say that those, that the expiration of rental agreement exclusion would not apply to
just moving it from an exemption to an exclusion. Is that what you're?
Yeah, I'm saying that rather than putting language around that owner-occupied rentals are exempted generally, rather that they're exempted from the rental agreement expiration, not counting as just cause eviction.
I totally understand that. One thing, and these are my recommendations, but whatever we get agreed to, is we are not asking for exemptions from state law. So it is important to remember that kind of over here is a bunch of different reasons under state law that are reasons for eviction. So this wouldn't intend to supersede that. So I don't know if I'm articulating this well. I don't think there was any intent ever to say that you can evict somebody today for just cause and nobody would be exempted from that. So I'm struggling a little bit about what, in fact, this ordinance at the end of the day really is focused primarily on non-renewals of lease and personal disagreements. So I don't disagree with your comment. I'm just not, it's hard to articulate how do you connect that dot.
You're on mute, Brian.
Sorry about that. I believe what Councilor Carpenter is saying, at least how I understand it, is that non-renewal is we are essentially saying is with a no cause, well, with a just cause eviction ordinance that will eventually come, that the only grounds for non-renewal are those reasons for cause. And
Yeah.
so I think you're saying that it's not necessary to stipulate that the owner-occupied properties would be restricted from just sort of taking, evicting someone for any reason they choose, because that's already protected. That's already governed by law.
Right,
The non-renewal is exactly what we're focused on.
right.
I think that we don't know how the ordinance will go in the future, and setting a precedence for owner occupied just generally not being exempted from this isn't great. It's not something that I'll over argue, but I think the second thing is I don't know, and I think it would be good to make clear, it's like, what about owner occupied properties that don't have lease terms, that don't have a lease, and how are they affected by this, if at all?
That's a good question. My understanding, I'm not an attorney and I don't even pretend to be one ever, but my understanding is if you are in a rental situation without a lease, that essentially the state law, the state landlord-tenant law, is what governs the relationship if there's really no lease at all. That's my understanding, is you have to follow state law. And so you do have certain requirements around eviction and non-renewal under state law. And then the city has an additional layer of requirements for those without written leases. There's a 90-day notice for both rent increase and for non-renewal, up to 2 years of tenancy. And after 2 years, it's actually 120 days of notice for rent increase and non-renewal. So that's for someone without a lease. So that's sort of the.
So, yeah. So again, I think not knowing how people's behavior will change because of us doing this, we don't necessarily want to say, oh, if you then just don't have a lease, you can evict people after 6 months, because that creates a huge incentive to not have a lease, which has, the opposite effect of what I think we're looking for. I don't know if that will happen, but I don't know why we would put ourselves in a position to make that a possibility when we don't have to, when we could just specify you're exempt from this thing that we may put into just cause.
Actually, Zara, I'm going to go back because I had rewritten this to take that into account. So I'm hoping
Call it up. Sarah, can you call it up on your screen so we can see what you're?
Well, I have it. How do I do the share screen? That's the.
I think Christine has to enable you as a host.
Okay, so you should be able to share now, Counselor Carpenter. At the bottom, just hit the share screen button.
Okay. I think that's it. Okay. So if you read down towards the bottom, it says further, there will be exemptions from provisions related to expired rental agreements and personal disagreements, and then lists the list. So I added a sentence there to narrow it to those provisions. Is that?
Sorry, so this is the same as what is posted on the
It
CD?
should be,
It is.
yes.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that addresses my, I don't think that addresses my concern. And
Well,
maybe you could convince me otherwise.
I guess I'm struggling with what your concern is. That I tried to narrow the exemption to the provisions related to expired rental agreements and personal disagreements.
I see.
Otherwise, they would be subject to the rest of the ordinance. I mean, meaning that if you want to evict somebody, it would be sort of under state law. So I guess I'm not clear how else to write that.
No, I think I see what you did now.
That was different than what I had done a little bit earlier.
Yes, I might think through it to be more, yeah, one, I think Stephen's exception on occupied 3 units or fewer is good. And then I think rewording that a little bit to be a little bit more clear, because I missed it and I thought I read through it carefully. But yes, I think that is we're on the same page, and that's a valid solution in terms of owner occupied properties.
So I sense that if we stopped this, if we ended this at the end of the phrase, personal disagreements for owner occupied properties, period. And the rest of that paragraph, or not paragraph, the rest of the highlighted section, or the rest of the proposed amendment was stricken, that we'd have agreement on that.
I don't understand why personal disagreements is in there. So it would make sense to me to say we're exempting owner occupied units, 3 units or fewer, from the expired rental agreements provision. But I don't understand how, if you have a personal disagreement, that just seems like a phrase that's in there that doesn't need to be. I don't know what we're trying to achieve with that.
Well, so stepping back up, the whole point of this was to require a landlord to give you a reason for eviction. And 2 of those reasons are not your lease is expired, and they're not I can't get along with you. So that's kind of the gut of what the just cause is trying to protect. The exemptions are the group of property owner landlords that would still have the ability to terminate your lease for no cause. So owner occupied buildings could terminate your lease for no cause. And this is why I think if any of this is going to be adopted, we maybe need a lawyer's review, because we're kind of mixing things up a little bit. We're also saying a just cause is if the landlord wants to move in his immediate family. A just cause is if they want to take it off the rental market. A just cause is if they want to do substantial renovations. So that's what we're saying. Those are reasons they can terminate your tenancy. Or those are being proposed. That is what is typical, and it is a little bit different than an owner occupied building is a building type, I guess you could say, like a hospital, or it's a sort of a building ownership, whereas the others are stating you can terminate a lease for no cause if you're going to sell it, if you're going to renovate it substantially, or if your family's going to move in.
So not to, I think we're moving into territory that Brian was trying to get us not to get.
Okay,
to
well, that's what
Yeah.
I'm just trying to make the distinction around from how it's presented. I appreciate we're kind of mixing types, and that's all I was trying to point out.
And so the thing that has me confused, I think, is I don't consider right now the way that it's written, it reads to me like we're saying if you have a personal disagreement, you don't have to wait till the end of the lease to evict someone. This just doesn't apply to you at all. You can still do the whatever, however many months it is, which I don't think is what we're trying to say. And I
No.
don't, yes. So
on that in particular,
wait, let me sorry, let me finish. So I think to some extent, I think we added it up top to have like something else that it excludes, but I'm not like, I think it's causing a lot of confusion without adding a lot. So I'm not sure why we have it in there. So I think it may be worth thinking about taking it out at all. And then down below, if we do decide to keep it in, which I would argue we should just take it out, it may be, I think we want to make sure that it doesn't read that, oh, a personal disagreement is a reason for eviction, which I think is how it reads right now.
okay.
What I was hoping we could do is come to agreement that on how the exemption of owner-occupied properties of 3 or fewer units on the essentially exempt them from just cause eviction.
I'm okay with that. I hated all the arguments that we heard for it. I thought some of them were morally bad. I don't know how else to phrase that, but I do think as a policy initiative, I know that a lot of homeowners are frustrated by how housing around them is kind of falling apart. And I think anything that we can do to incentivize owner-occupied units is a good thing. So I'm especially like just thinking about my ward, but I think also the city as a whole, it makes sense to me to have that as a policy goal of having more owner-occupied rentals. So I'm okay with having that as an exemption.
Okay, so we have agreement, at least on that part. What I hear or what I see as the language, Councilor Carpenter, that you've offered, and I do understand, and I appreciate the sentiment and the attempt here to put up front what exemptions are found in most other ordinances, or at least a compilation of those. But I think the argument still holds that the charter change is the wrong tool, the wrong vehicle for trying to accomplish what you're setting out to accomplish. And in fact, the ordinance development and adoption process is still that place to do that. And I know we've talked about it, and I do understand that you're concerned about the accusation being made and the perception that this is creating a wide open sort of blank check, but that really what we are trying to do is as one of the people in public comment said, is create, give the city the authority to regulate this part of the landlord-tenant relationship, and not attempt in the charter change to tie our hands too much around what will and won't be in the ordinance. So I still think that holds. And Councilor Hightower, you're looking to speak, but I'll let you address that. And that's sort of where I think we're getting. So I think we don't want to belabor this too much, because I don't think the 3 of us are going to come to consensus on your exemptions.
Yeah, to hopefully not repeat too much of what's been said or what will be said, but I think those exemptions are so problematic to me, especially the family member, knowing that like 3 of our biggest landlord kind of property holdings are families in Burlington, and how easily they could say, can somebody move in here for a month? I want us to make sure that we're flexible, and if we want to make that an exception, and how that plays out. And putting it into the charter change does not give us that even a little bit. And it's going to be used as a loophole for the very properties that we're the most worried about, this, like, needing this protection. And so like, my stance on this hasn't changed even a little bit. I would not pass this if that language is in there, because I think it's gutting it. It's really gutting it for, I think, some of the properties that we're the most worried about. And the other thing, and we haven't got there yet, but I think the other thing that's really problematic is the 1 year after occupancy, because I do think, and I don't think it'll do this for I'm not blanket saying that it'll do this for every property manager, every landlord, but for some of them, they like to see turnover every year, or they don't care about turnover every year. So if they get to say, hey, you have to leave after a year, that's undoing, in some cases, will be achieving stability for some places, but then getting, especially in kind of student dominated areas, will be like almost incentivizing the landlord to not allow for that stability and ask people to move after every year. And to really, like one of the people said, I think it was Dan, incentivize student housing over longer term residents, which is not something that I want to see in my ward, which is already very student heavy. Not that I don't want students, but that, students become preferred renters, and the universities take even less responsibility for, housing students. So those are two things I just cannot vote yes for.
Well, a couple of different comments on the owner or immediate family. Again, that has been pretty universal across all of the ordinances that I've seen. It takes definition for family member, and some have more definition than others. Some that I've read have, tests around, it has to be occupied by the family member for 6 months, or, there's varied nuances that go along with it. And I totally get that putting anything in the charter change that clarifies it is a slippery slope. But I'm at a point with all of the public input that I've had that we need to clarify. Owners need to understand today, if they're going to vote on it, what they can do with their house tomorrow. And so this is a very common exception, and I'm not ready to make our just cause eviction provision. It isn't going to cover everybody. It's just not. And we could spend a little time. We don't have a lot of time talking to the hundreds of places that have this and see how much of a problem it's been or not. The same thing really goes, what was the other one you talked about? Substantial repair, that's very common. The 1 year is predominantly in the model ordinances from Oregon and California. I did speak to those people from those states. At the time, I didn't ask them about that provision. Many of those communities have universities in them. So, I can try to find out if they've in fact, if that's been problematic in terms of sort of moving more to 1 year leases. The reason behind it was, folks saying, you're telling me that at the end of the day, if it doesn't work out, and it's just not a good arrangement, I have no choice but to continue to rent. And this is almost like a sort of a trial period, which is, you should know by the first year they're there, if this is going to work or not work. I mean, things change in people's lives, but that's kind of the intent of it. I do want to make a comment too, that one of the speakers kept talking about this provision and what happens now in law, which would not change. Landlords continue to have the right in their lease to set renewal terms now, and that this provision isn't going to change that. I mean, they can say to you, if 6 months from now, you need to tell me whether you're going to rent it for the next year. And if you choose not to renew your lease, then your lease isn't going to renew. I mean, that this does not address that concern that people have today.
Councilor Hightower.
Yeah, so two things, which is, I don't know how many of the towns you looked at where 3 or 4 families own such a vast majority of the rental market. We're gonna have to be flexible with how we enforce that. And right now, saying where the owner or close family member is intending to move in is going to tie us to things that we will find out in enforcement will be problematic and will create loopholes. I'm not saying it can't be an exception, and I don't think any of us are saying that. I'm saying that writing it into the charter change is something we can't do if we're gonna regulate it effectively in Burlington. It doesn't make sense for our city based on how many family-owned property rentals we have. It just doesn't. And on the other part, the student housing, Burlington is the first university-dominated town that I'm in that has the insane turnover. And like, I've never lived somewhere, and I've lived in college towns and college-dominated towns where most of the rentals are college-based, like New Haven. And yes, there's turnover over the summer, but Burlington's the only place I've ever lived where there is a week where everything turns over. Landlords do not have the same power in other university towns as they do in Burlington. There's not this one gap period where everybody's expected to move, and there's not the same amount of turnover even in other university towns that there is in Burlington. Like, people who stay, you know, in one apartment for all of their university things in Burlington is so rare. And I was absolutely floored when I moved here as a fresh grad in terms of what our rental market is like. And so I understand that this is things that happens in other places, but I think not recognizing that Burlington is a little bit unique, both in the family aspect and in the 1-year aspect, and that we're gonna have to be flexible in how we regulate it it's not, I find it naive. We're gonna have to be flexible. We're not gonna figure this all out beforehand. We're gonna have to try it, see what happens, pivot, change, and make sure that if we do have exceptions, that they're not gutting the just cause language and putting it into the charter change does not allow us to do that. And so I hear that this is a common thing, and I'm not saying that we can't have those exceptions. I'm saying that putting them here for what Burlington looks like does not make sense.
I would also add, this is something that a constituent raised with me sometime in the last year, that in her work, she was encountering increasingly younger people who were first-time renters who were being asked and basically being required to sign a lease for 360 days rather than 365, so that the owner could get them out in time to do sort of turnover preparation for the first of the next month. And so that 1-year provision would clearly put those folks at a pretty significant disadvantage, because it would, and that's becoming more common, unfortunately. We may have to deal with that. That's an issue, because it does put people into a real squeeze who don't have options and can't move into a new place yet till the first of the month. And there's like this 5 to 6 day period that people are scrambling. So that's just something for us to keep in mind. I don't think we're going to get, it's 8 o'clock, and I don't think we're going to get, 3-way agreement here. So what I think makes sense is, we've reached agreement at least, and we'd have to deal with the details of the language, but as for, at this point, we have a charter change language coming back to the full council at, I believe, scheduled to come to the council from the Charter Change Committee on the 23rd. And so I would be, as the chair of this committee, I would be willing to convey to the Charter Change Committee on the committee's behalf that we have come to consensus on making that change, or we can just propose it, at the council meeting on the 23rd if that's not acceptable, because the committee may have already, I think they've already voted out the language.
Do we know when the Charter Change Committee is meeting?
I don't have that information. I think they've already voted this out though, so I don't think they're taking this up, but you were just saying we could raise it with them at that point?
Yeah, I don't know either.
I just wanted to make sure it wasn't tonight.
No, I think it's Thursday or tomorrow. There is one this week, I think, but
Yeah.
I don't think this is on the agenda.
No.
I think it makes sense then to share that we had agreement on at least this one thing. And Christy said they already voted it out.
Yeah,
Yes, they did.
they have.
Oh, okay.
The 2-to-1 voted it out. So
Okay.
yeah. So then what we will do procedurally is prepare an amendment and notify the rest of the council as it comes up on the agenda on the 23rd, and we'll go that route at least. And Councilor Carpenter, it's every councilor's prerogative to propose other amendments, but I think what we've been able to do is come to agreement on the owner-occupied provision. I think that's the best we're going to do tonight.
Okay.
Okay.
That's fair.
Let's go into a really easy topic, the licensing of rental property owners. I want to share an email that I received from Councilor Mason in his role as chair of the Ordinance Committee. And I just wanted to share that because I think that the information he provided is particularly relevant to this discussion.
And Councilor Hightower is on ordinance as well, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I don't need to share the. I don't even. I think I sent it.
I didn't realize it at the time, but I think I had mentioned that maybe you can give us an update.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we've discussed this twice. The first time being just that this was something on our agenda that we should look at, and then I assume former Councilor Busher will want to speak to this. So we had an update from former Councilor Busher, I think maybe Jean Bergman, although I wouldn't guarantee that. I would need to go back and look at my notes. And the Code Enforcement Office on some of the implications. I don't think we got that far into some of the substantive issues. I am going to go back and look at my notes, actually.
Yeah, you've got it. I mean, essentially, Councilor Mason said that the Ordinance Committee agreed not to move forward with a separate landlord registration system, but rather to task the city attorney with coming back with proposed amendments to the existing registration system to allow penalties to be imposed across multiple properties for, quote, a bad landlord, end of quote. We also tasked permitting inspections with reporting back in November on other suggestions to improve the existing system and target problematic property owners.
Right. So to sum it up, and I'm sure I haven't looked at Chip's email, having just gotten that, or having gotten that forward, but I think kind of what gave us pause from looking at specifically at licensing was that we had a hard time articulating what problem licensing would solve. And so I think we wanted to go back to, it sounds like one of the big things is that we just don't have much enforcement teeth to landlords who aren't responding to enforcement in a way that we want them to. And so we decided to go with that route first of how do we get those teeth? And if that's licensing, that's great. And if there's another option, that's also great. So focusing on the problem first and then deciding what the appropriate solution is.
I mean,
Great. Well, we have that summary. I would open up to the two people who spoke and said they'd like to address us on this topic, at least so far, was, if we're going to use the term former counselor, we can say former Counselor Busher and former Counselor Monk.
make it.
Both wanted to speak on this topic. So Christine Curtis, if you would make them panelists, or at least start with Counselor Busher and then former Counselor Busher and then former Counselor Monka. And former Counselor Bergman wants to speak as well.
Hi, did you want to start with me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, okay, all right. So this was one of the last communications that I gave, actually it was on the last night that I was a city councilor. And the timing was lousy, but it reflected a year's worth of work that I didn't do in isolation, that I did with my staff person at the time, Jean Bergman. And it came from, as some may know, I know Councilor Hightower's heard this before, but I don't think the other two members have. It came from a person who was a state rep, Dean Corrin, who lived still in Ward 1, who felt pretty strongly that licensing was something that we should consider. Having said that, I felt it had never really been thoroughly explored and wanted to give it that shot before we discounted it as an option. Now, what you got from Councilor Mason and what Councilor Hightower just gave you was the fact that we do have a registration process, which for the most part brings compliance with most of these property owners. I don't know what percentage, but I would say above 90%. And so but then there's that 10% that don't comply. And they waste our resources, our human resources from code enforcement. They waste a lot of time. And these few people actually own a lot of properties. So it's not representative to focus on the individuals, but on the number of properties. And so we did have the data, and Councilor Hanson is on the ordinance committee, and he was part of peripherally some of this conversation. So he knew some of this information that there were, that code, Jackie and Bill both, I'm sorry, not Jackie, Patty and Bill both provided a fair amount of information to me regarding the data and who the outliers were, and the fact that our current system does not bring them in compliance or bring them to the table. So we looked at also, there's a perception that licensing is something that is rarely done, but that's not true. If you really look throughout the US, licensing is a tool that many communities use. And the power of licensing is that if you own investment properties, just like if you own a bar, you need a permit to do business in the city of Burlington. And if you have that permit and you don't, and you're not a good steward, then you can lose that permit. Now, one of the things that, and one of the people who had concerns were the housing advocates. So former counselor, my friend, my neighbor, Erhard Monka, really had some concerns about the displacement of residents and tenants. I think we all would have that same concern. If you isolate it to, if you own 20 properties and you've got one that isn't compliant, you don't displace 20, all the residents in 20 properties. You focus on the property that's the problem. And so that's what you do. And what we learned was that those communities that use licensing rarely had to get to that point. Now, as Councilor Mason and Councilor Hightower and the city will tell you, in the current ordinance, registration ordinance, there is the power of receivership. There is that. People have never utilized that. So I don't, well, why would I object? I'm just a citizen. But anyways, I don't object to the city looking at whether or not they can understand what tools that exist currently that they don't use, and why don't they use them, and could they use them, and would that bring about compliance in the same way that licensing would? I'm not so sure. I think that this would send a really strong message. I met with Apartment Owners, Inc. I went into the lion's den. I wanted to know, with the people who had the most resistance, what the problem was and how this would be perceived. They weren't excited about it, but most of these, as I stated, most of these investment property owners are good people and they comply. So it's only the ones that are problematic that should be concerned, and rightly so, because I don't want them to own property in Burlington if they don't comply and they don't provide safe housing and we can't get them to the table and we're wasting lots of money on them. I don't want them to own property. I'm upfront and straight, and I've been straight ever since I took this up. So the other point, and you know, Brian, I know you don't have a mute button. Maybe you do actually. But anyways, the other point that I wanted to make is that for those who think it would be labor intensive, and I'm sure that attorneys might point you in that direction, but what I'm going to tell you is that the current registration form and ordinance or process could be easily modified to become a licensing process. The thing that is the hiccup here is that we don't have the authority to do this. We need to go to the state to get that authority. We need a charter change. So that is an obstacle, one that I think we can overcome, but it hasn't been tested. So the point that I wanted to just leave all of you with is that I really do believe, I think that rightly so, get the data, find out what I found out. I think I provided some of that in the communication, but if I didn't, shame on me. But I think Jean Bergman could help provide some of that information. Joe Spidell was part of the process and helped me interconnect with people around the U.S. and communities around the U.S., and part of your packet gives you some of that information. And I think that the university was interested too. I think we all want to provide safe and good housing for people. We all want people to comply, and we need more tools in order to make that happen. And so that's the point. And when the day is done, if all of you have looked at this and the city has looked at this carefully and said, we don't need this, we can just augment what we currently have, so be it. I just hope we get to a better endpoint, because compliance and safe housing is really the name of the game for me. Thank you.
Thank you, former Councilor Busher. And now we have former Councilor Monka up next.
Sorry, sometimes the unmute button on my phone won't work. Thanks for the time, and thanks for taking this up. As my esteemed former colleague Sharon mentioned, we disagree pretty deeply on this, and I also disagree, obviously, with former State Rep Dean Corrin. We've all had many go-rounds and had I think a number of lively discussions, but here's why I disagree. First of all, I think we have the structure in place. It may need to be augmented, it may need to be increased, but I think we have the structure in place to address the issues that are of concern, which are, you know, as Sharon says, I think probably a relatively small percentage of landlords, but some of them fairly large. My concern is around displacement. And let me just back up for 1 second and just say, and admit that maybe there's a little bit of pride of ownership here, because actually way back when, Ted Wimpy and I worked with various stakeholders, with the city attorney, with some then counselors, and with the Landlord Association, which was then run by our old friend Stuart Bennett. And we sat around a table for months and basically came up with the current legal framework that we have now, including receivership provisions, and basically focused it on, as I think you know, a certificate of habitability type program, so that you weren't targeting necessarily an owner per se, but you were targeting problem units. And the concern around displacement is if you go to a licensing system, much like a bar, if you revoke the business license of a bar, it closes. And if you revoke the business license of a landlord, then that landlord cannot operate that property anymore. They've lost their license to operate the business. What do you do then? Who's going to come in and be a receiver? Who's going to manage the property? In some instances, this may be property that's some of it may have been disinvested. There may not be a lot of equity there for a receiver to come in and borrow the funds or somehow secure funds to bring it up to code. So we did build in a receivership piece, but the receivership is potentially problematic. When we did that back then, Paul Detman was the executive director of the Burlington Housing Authority, and Paul was willing to take this on, but also expressed some real reservations about whether or not receivership might actually work in extreme situations. So if you're, I would look first, as you know, I think it looks like your ordinance committee has suggested. I have not been attending those meetings. There's only so many city council committee meetings that I'm able to attend these days. But if they're on a path to look at how to strengthen the existing ordinance, that's something that I would certainly encourage and recommend. I think you've also got a resource issue. You know, when we went to comprehensive code enforcement, it included all the quality of life issues. And so code enforcement has to balance, you know, someone who complains about front yard parking versus somebody who's living, a tenant who's living in seriously substandard conditions. And that's a balancing act, and there may not be enough resources for Bill Ward and his team to do the level of enforcement that is needed. If you have to up the fines or you know, create other legal mechanisms within the current structure to help create greater compliance, so be it. But if you do go to this, I do have concerns about, you know, basically if there's no receiver and you've revoked somebody's license to do business, what happens to those tenants? Who continues to operate that property? Do they get displaced because you've essentially shut down an entire building or an entire series of buildings that are owned by one landlord? You know, one mitigating factor is that, you know, a lot of properties are owned by LLCs, so there's, you know, some firewalls between them, so you may not be shutting down an entire large landlord's properties by doing this, but you know, you may just be shutting down one or a couple of buildings. That's something that we didn't look at back then, but basically we went to a certificate of habitability program to avoid this kind of revocation of a license that could have repercussions beyond one or two units that are out of compliance, and units that are absolutely in compliance could be jeopardized, and the ability of that landlord to do business and to continue to rent those would be jeopardized if you went to landlord licensing and revoked their license. I think that covers most of my comments. Well, I guess the other thing I would say is, you know, if this is requiring a charter change, I mean, that's another hurdle. I would, before going to a charter change, I would definitely look at the existing tools that you have and enhancing the existing tools first. So thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just for the sake of clarity, at least from the email that I read from Councilor Mason, they're not recommending that it go forward as a charter change. So that is not That is not on the table presently. But I appreciate that.
I think I was speaking to Sharon's comment that in her research, licensing would require a charter change.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that clarification. And we have one more person who's indicated desire to speak. That's former city attorney, former city councilor, Gene Bergman.
There we go. Let me start with Erhard's last point about the suspension or revocation. You know, you have that problem right now. So those issues, in terms of them being a tool, are with us and have been with us since we amended the registration ordinance those many years ago, and I was actually your staff person or the staff person who did that. So I do not think that it is a valid excuse, a valid reason not to proceed with licensing. There are issues related to what you do with a landlord who appears to be incapable of properly managing their places, and we've got that regardless of whether you license them or you have a registration program or you would bail on the whole thing and move to the state system, which I definitely do not recommend. But you've got this, and you have to face it, and sometimes it requires landlords not having the right to rent. And I know that there was one case where we brought forward registration when I was the code enforcement director. And that was actually quite helpful in terms of turning a landlord who just could not manage his place to turn that around. We actually did not put it in receivership, but we began the process to do that. It is definitely difficult and requires a lot of resources. What the memo that Councillor Busher put forward to the council asked the committees, both ordinance and the CDNR, to do is to investigate this. And I want to go back to that and ask you to continue to do that. Not to shut off the conversation, not to say that it needs a charter change, so we're not going to do that. We'll let charter change do that, or we don't have an ordinance. But to look at the issue and decide to get CEDO as staff to look into, and the city attorney's office to look into different models and how it can be useful. I personally think that it is useful, and not just in the habitability world. So right now what you've gotten is everything is a nail, we're going to use a hammer. This is the code enforcement approach. But the bar analogy, I think, is a valid one, because what that process does is say, is an entity fit to be engaged in a business which in the bar case is inherently dangerous. I mean, we know how wonderful bars are, and not a lot of us, I think, are teetotalers, and yet we all can recognize the dangers. Okay, that's clear, and that comes from an historic place. Landlords have a tremendous responsibility to provide housing for people who can't do it for themselves because they don't own the property, for lots of reasons. And as we see with the pandemic, it's critical to the health of our community, to the health of the nation. It's why so many people talk about housing as a human right. So there are a whole lot of things that you can get when you have a landlord have to first go to a licensing entity and say, I'm fit to be a landlord. There's that process that bar owners have to go through is something which weeds out folks who are not ready to take on that responsibility. And they have to continually do trainings. You can't require trainings under the current set of ordinances. The authority that, and you will have to go to get a charter change, but I am advocating for you to explore this and see that there are things that will be very helpful to provide safe, affordable housing if you adopt a licensing provision. One of them is the requirement for training. You got it partially with a lead paint world, but that is basically because you've got the state regulations on lead paint and you've got those standards. You don't have them on anything else. There are a lot, and then I just want to make one last point, and then Carrie, you guys can take it. But you started to hear in the just cause eviction conversation issues that are not related to habitability, but are related to the landlord-tenant relationship, such as the notices that are being required to renew leases. These guys, people are starting to rent places now for June. They're not living in them until June, and then many of them, because they're student housing, are not living in them until September. And then they're being told in October that they've got to renew their lease. I mean, that's freaking asinine in my mind. But I mean, there is a valid business reason I can see, but I think that from a housing standpoint, I think it's just fundamentally wrong. You can't regulate that. There's a number of other lease things that that we have seen in practices that we have seen that would be helpful to be clarified, and that that a licensing authority, and I think that the charter change will have to make it clear as to what that what extent that is, but that a licensing authority would have to get in there. I've heard that there are landlords who are charging tenants or putting provisions in leases to require tenants pay for their attorney's fees if they go to court, if they sue their landlord for court. And we know that that is not legal. You can't, that breaks a state law that says that you have the right to a habitable housing. But it's so far down the line in terms of this relationship, and there's no entities that are navigating that are regulating that are mediating that. So when you have a process that's upfront that says, these are the rules, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do, you need to do some training on certain things, that's real value. And so I don't have all the answers, and what I would again suggest that you do is you take this up as one of the charges that was given to you by the city council in the adoption of that resolution, and take a deeper dive in this. I'm more than happy to assist the committee in any way possible. I'm sure that the counselors that I work for currently would, at least some of them would not mind me engaging with you on that on their behalf as well. So thanks for the time, and keep on keeping on. Thanks.
Thank you. Christine Curtis, we're minutes away from what we had hoped to end at 8:30, but we'll keep going. We have Christy Delphia followed by Stephen Marshall as comments that want to be added. And Councillor Carpenter, can we come back to you at that point?
All right, I'm going to rezone everything that Jean just said. And I had a couple of things in there. Tenants are also right now being forced, as of the last year, maybe year and a half or so, to renew their leases 9 months in advance. Landlords are literally telling tenants right now that if they do not renew their leases 9 months in advance, when Vermont state law only says 3 months is what's required, that they will come in and parade people through their apartments and show them. We have business that we've been told by quite a few tenants that they won't even rent them an apartment right now unless they put their money, give business permission to do direct deposit with their rent. That's against state law. That negates all their ability to be able to withhold rent if these landlords don't make the necessary repairs to their apartments. You know, these are all things that would partially be stopped by landlord licensing. This also would negate them from being able to hide under them LLCs. And a good portion of the landlords out there right now, if you look in your landlord database, you go to research, because everybody says, you know, landlords research their tenants. Tenants should be able to research their landlords to see exactly what kind of housing violations that they have or code violations they have. And right now, with the database being so old, half the landlords out there aren't even registered as rentals. So you can't research your landlord the way you should be able to see if they have multiple code violations. You know, it's just, it's not fair to the tenant. Licensing would take care of quite a bit of this. So I would urge you as well, like Jean said, to be doing more research on this. I would also like to remind you that we did have this. The BTU does have this on our list of demands. Was one of our demands for licensing because of everything that Jean just said. And with the new way that landlords are now trying to put in illegal clauses in their leases on tenants all the time. And we don't have the resources in which to be able to research them to get the right information that we require. You know, so this would make it a lot easier and on all fronts, including the habitability issues. So I would strongly urge you to definitely go forward with this and do the necessary research. And if there's got to be a charter change, then make it one, because it only makes it fair for all parties involved, really. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We will obviously have some free time now that we have are going to move Jeff's cause along, so we'll be coming to something new at a future meeting. But Stephen Marshall had hoped to put his name in the queue here. So Stephen, if you're still with us, and Christine has enabled you as a panelist. We are ready when you are.
There's the video, there's the mute. Now you can see me this time.
I recognize
there
you.
was a button. I love everything Gene Bergman said. I love everything that Christy said. I do disagree with Earhart. I think that the problems that he sees are surmountable. I think that any of these issues can be surmounted in the proper weighing of the issues. I would like to speak to the point of professionalism. I'd like to point out that we require haircutters to get a license. Now, why do haircutters get a license? Because if they mess up, they can do damage to another human being. We require lawyers and doctors and all kinds of people to get licenses because they can do damage to other people's lives. How much more power does a person have to have over other people's lives than a landlord before you actually require them to get licensed? It just seems like an ethically necessary step to take. So that's really all I really wanted to say about that. It just seems logically necessary. Going back to what, what Sharon said about how the Landlords Association was like, well, we're not too hot on it, but you know what? Yeah, we could get along with it. Because most of them dwell in the professional class. They understand, a lot of them understand what it means to act professionally. They don't want to hurt their tenants because they want stable tenants. The purpose of landlord licensing is to give the governmental entity, in this case, the city of Burlington, the power to say to people who are not doing a good job, we've got you by the, we have you. We can take your right to rent away from you. You will clean up your act or sell off your properties. I guess that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Committee open forum is the next item on our agenda, and that item is intended to give the committee members a chance to say, we want to work on this, at our next meeting, or we want to raise this issue. This is an opportunity to do that. Councilor Carpenter, your hand went up about 15 minutes ago, so I'll ask you to.
Well, and I didn't realize we had two other speakers, but it's really in that same vein. On the landlord licensing, I do think it would be prudent to have at least one joint meeting or something with ordinance. They've spent time on it. I know Bill Ward and Patty Wayman have spent time with them. Eileen spent time with them. I don't want to ask the same people to keep spending time with us. So I'm just going to suggest that they've been tasked with doing some work. They meaning the code enforcement office and the city attorney. When that work gels, maybe we should meet jointly with them, hear that discussion and talk about how we want to pursue it. There's a very gray difference between a robust registration and a license. And so at some level we'll have yet to discuss that, but I think we're not there yet. So I need to understand better what do we have in place now, and then what do we need to add. I think in terms of future work for the committee, it would be prudent of us to maybe pull together a laundry list of problems that we want to look at. I mean, we just talked about the leasing issue. In my research on Just Cause, I actually noticed that a number of jurisdictions require a basic model lease. So they require a lease that presumably is legal. I mean, you can enhance the lease if you're a landlord, and you can add provisions, but the jurisdiction says the minimum lease is this. So what I'm maybe suggesting is we have a work session looking at, we had talked about tenant protections. What other things are problems? And then from the problem list, maybe do some research about, how would you solve those problems? And it appears anything that's contrary to landlord-tenant law of the state is a charter change, but I'm thinking we should sort of amass some of those rather than do them, one-off. Am I making sense?
Yes, that's very helpful. Councilor Hightower, there's been a few times where you have asked for updates on the accountability list, which is something the city council tries to hold itself accountable. And so I've reviewed that accountability list. I have to let's see, I'm going to go through it right now. Sorry about, there may be some background noise because there are members of my family who are looking to eat dinner. So that may be something you all.
Go to Zariah's house.
I can't tell if you're hearing it or not, but we have some pretty big issues that are still in here as being referred to our committee. One of those items that I see here is we obviously have been dealing with housing policy reforms and expanding tenant protections. That's one of our biggest assignments, and we've been trying to tackle that for literally 12 months now. So we've been on that. The other item here, though, is
I'm sorry, Brian, what was that for? What did you just say?
It was essentially some of the housing policy reforms, which we accomplished many of those. Those are ones that dealt with, the parking minimums. We actually haven't touched the short-term rental issue, and that's in ordinance for I believe it's still in joint committee, Councilor Hightower, I think. So that's an issue which we could ask to spend some time on, because I think there are real important community development and neighborhood revitalization implications for a short-term rental housing policy, which I personally have very strong feelings about, and I actually proposed to the mayor that this be included in the housing policy reforms several years ago. So that was one that I believe we should be focused on. The other one that's still in here, which was a referral last January of 2020, was the issue of voting for all, sometimes referred to as resident but non-citizen voting in local elections. That issue was referred to us, and there's no report back deadline, but it's something that's remains on our to-do list. We have this issue here we've been discussing, the licensing of landlords. There is, we can go back quite a ways in time and see some other issues. There was a discussion about a senior services study committee that I believe completed its work already, and so I don't think that's germane anymore. But those are ones that that jump out at me from this accountability list.
So a quick comment on the short-term rentals. The joint committee, since I've joined it, has probably had 2 or 3, I think 3 meetings on it. So just because we're being so slow and deliberate about the process, I think it might be a good idea if you all have time, if you joined those meetings, just because I know that Chip is always hesitant to make changes after we go through them with the planning commission, commission, whatever that.
Yep.
So I can definitely forward any of those meeting times to you. I think the next one will be November 24th, if I'm not mistaken. So I think it would be great if you all could join those meetings, not to say that there shouldn't be another way that you all look at them and you'll look at them as counselors overall anyway, but I think it'd be great to just have your voices as we're going through the process itself.
Great, thank you for that. And just to clarify for myself and for members of the public, is the joint committee all of the ordinance committee of the council and all of the planning commission, or the planning commission's ordinance committee?
It's all of the planning committee.
I see, so it's 7 commissioners from there and 3 counselors?
Yes.
Okay. 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 I think we have, I will propose, I think Councilor Hightower's suggestion is the most appropriate one for us to engage with that process as counselors rather than try to pull it into this committee. It's probably too cumbersome at this point, given that you have 10 people working on it, and then to say, oh, now give it to the 3 of us. We'll I think enter into that process the way you suggested makes the most sense. We have some minutes to approve from meetings on September 16th, October 8th, October 19th, October 21st, and October 27th. Wow, there's a lot. We've been busy. So I would entertain a motion on those minutes.
I'm happy to move to approve those minutes.
I'll
Councilor,
second.
moved and seconded. Any changes or discussion about the minutes? Councilor Carpenter, you look like you feel like you need to
I'm
read them.
hoping they're okay. I've read some of them, but not all of them. But I'm going to leave that. I don't think. I think we should approve
Yeah,
them.
I did review them, and I appreciate the fact that they are. I personally, as someone who used to take minutes for this committee in my old job, I don't like verbatim minutes. I don't like long committee discussion minutes. I think it's best to kind of stick with the format that Christine has followed here. So, all in favor of approving the minutes as stated, please say aye.
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 Any opposed or abstaining? Looks like the ayes have it. Okay. Would you be okay with attempting to schedule this through email, or do you want to pick a date now? Councilor Hightower, your schedule is beyond belief. I feel terrible whenever I try and schedule with you. You're not free till December.
Yes, I'm free
Right.
on December 1st, and then the next week as well.
Okay. Okay. Well, maybe we could look ahead to that week. I think there's Uh, when I say Wednesday, it's 2nd of December?
I can't do Wednesdays.
Wednesday, okay.
That's
That's a matter of course. Wednesdays are no good?
it's the SRO task force, is everyone.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And you're almost weekly, aren't you?
We are weekly.
You are weekly, okay. Yeah. So either the 1st or the 3rd? I think there's something we're doing on the 1st as in our elected officials capacity. So I think
Yes, I think there
Oh,
is. I've
yeah.
heard about that.
Yeah.
What do we have for, I'm just confused about schedule in general.
does the 3rd work for either or both of you?
I have
No?
joint committee.
Oh, that's joint committee, okay.
What about the, oh, you said you're not through, I was gonna say the 30th, but actually, I don't know a lot about it. On the 30th, the Regional Planning Commission is having a housing forum.
Yeah.
And so I'm just noting that.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I did get that information, and I do plan to attend that on the 30th, yeah.
I was about to say that's the only thing I have that day. So if we didn't want to go to that, I could do it that day. But
Well, that starts at, I know, what time is it? 6 o'clock is what I have? Does that sound
That's
right?
a 6 to 8 o'clock scheduled meeting right
Yeah.
now.
we could. I don't know. I
If
know.
you want to meet for an hour before, does that work? Or?
I think your schedules are also a little bit more flexible than mine, and Mondays
Yes.
are off. So if we wanted to meet like 4 to 6
Yeah.
and have public forum at the end so that people who have.
Yep, I could do that. Sure. Okay, so let's go for 4 p.m. on Monday, November 30th. Anything else to come before the committee? Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, members of the public, for joining us tonight. And I think we will call it an evening. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night, everybody. Thanks a lot.